Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our last plenary session of Asia TEFL 2020 International Conference. My name is Kyungja An, and I'm from Seoul National University of Education in South Korea. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Taeyoung Kim. Dr. Kim is a professor at Chungang University in South Korea. His research interests center around L2 learning and teaching, motivation and demotivation, and the contribution of social culture theory and activity theory to L2 motivation. He authored or co-authored over 130 papers and book chapters, and his recent papers have been published in international journals such as System, Language and Intercultural Communication, and the Journal of Asia TEFL. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Dr. Kim about L2 learning and teaching, motivation and demotivation in South Korea, state of the art. If you're watching live stream, you're welcome to write your questions in the chat box. Now, please welcome Dr. Kim with a big hand.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction. Hello, my name is Taeyoung Kim from Chungang University. First of all, I would like to thank you for the conference organizer for inviting me to this 2020 Asia TEFL International Conference. Today, I'm going to talk about L2 learning and teaching demotivation and motivation, state of the art. So this is my brief summary and overview. First, I'm going to briefly introduce Gardner and Dorney's models, and then I'm going to explain some detail about the concept of demotivation and L2 teaching demotivation and motivation. And finally, I'm going to talk about L2 learner remotivation. So in this part, I'm going to introduce motivational languaging activities, and then I'm going to explain how we are going to actually remotivate our students' low level of motivation. And then there comes implications and suggestions. I think many of you are already quite accustomed to Gardner's socio-educational model. Even though you are not so familiar with socio-educational model, I think you are already quite familiar with this kind of concept, like two types of motivation, such as instrumental and integrative orientation. And in his Gardner socio-educational model, two types of orientation or motivation were widely known in our field. The first type is instrumental orientation, and this is typically related to EFL context. And this is the motivation to learn a language as a means for attaining instrumental goals, such as furthering a career, like being employed or being promoted, or reading technical materials. So because you have practical orientations, you have these instrumental orientations. Compared to instrumental orientation, integrative one is related to ESL context. And this is the motivation to be integrated into the culture of second or foreign language group and become involved in social interchange in that group. But at the turn of the century, because the concept of integrativeness has been widely questioned, because particularly for English as an international language's case, it is not quite clear the target language, how we are going to define the target language to be integrated. Such kind of question had arisen, particularly for Zoltan Dorney's L2 motivational self-system. In this L2 motivational self-system, he was influenced by Marcus and Neurius' possible self-theory. And in this theory, the authors distinguished ideal self, expected or default self, and feared self. In the case of ideal self, we can think about some positive future consequences. And in the case of feared self, you can also think about negative consequences. And default self is kind of just so-so consequences. So regardless of your making effort or not, you will become such kind of self in the future. This is the concept of expected or default self. In the case of Dorney, when he was thinking about L2 motivational self-system, we can think about three different components in this self-system. The first component was ideal L2 self. Second one is O2 L2 self. And the third component was L2 learning experience. In the case of ideal L2 self, this is the self that L2 learner's mental representation of the attributes that someone would ideally like to possess. So for example, if a learner is learning an English language because the learner wants to be a K-pop star in the future, so he or she wants to go to Hollywood. So in that case, that is ideal nature of future self. That's ideal L2 self. Compared to ideal L2 self, O2 L2 self, this is quite different one. In this case, the attributes that one believes one ought to possess. For example, various duties, obligations, or responsibilities in order to avoid possible negative outcomes. So perhaps an English learner is just studying English because he or she does not want to fail in the college entrance exam. That is one example of O2 L2 self. And the third component, L2 learning experience, that influence situation-specific motives related to the immediate learning environment and experiences. Because this is on-site and lively experiences, and this is because of the nature of L2 learning experiences, this one is always influencing ideal L2 self and also O2 L2 self. Now, today I'm going to focus on first, EFL learning demotivation. And because demotivation, compared to motivation, especially in EFL context, particularly in many Asian contexts, because English language is mandatory or obligatory courses. So students do not have any other choice but to just study English. So they do not have any option. So in that case, the issue of demotivation is a really, really important issue. Because this is an international conference, for international audience, I'm going to just briefly explain EFL educational context in South Korea. After the Korea-US Commercial Treaty was ratified in 1882, English was officially introduced to Korea, both South and North. And in South Korea, English is instructed from officially in public school from grade 3 to grade 12. And they are required to learn English as a major foreign language. English has been prioritized because it is, for sure, is a major subject in college scholastic ability test. And this is a crucial determiner for university admission. According to Statistics Korea, about 4 years ago, more than 18 billion US dollars was spent on private education, and mostly they were on after-school programs or hagwon or juku in Japanese language. And in this case, English accounted for the largest portion for this private education sector. When we conceptualize demotivation, we can think about, first, demotivation must be a decrease in motivation. In this line of research, they adopted mostly quasi-longitudinal or retrospective methods. According to Kim, 2011, he collected more than 6,000 elementary school students from grade 3 to 6. And in the next year, he also expanded the scope to including middle school and high school students. And he compared between motivational components and demotivation. And the general finding in those research was that demotivation is not just a simple mirror image of motivation. That means motivation and demotivation is not just the opposite relationship. Regarding this, I'm going to explain in detail very soon. And there are more studies, of course. According to Jung, she used retrospective methods, and a degree of motivation graph was used. And this motivation graph asked about university students' past experiences of learning English In Japanese context, Hasegawa, 2004, 125 junior high school and high school students were participated in this research. And not surprisingly, the number of students who lost interest in EFL learning was larger in high school than in junior high school. So as you can see in this graph, in elementary school students' case, we see constant decrease in students' motivation from grade 3 to grade 6. As you can see in this graph, there are constant decrease from grade 3. When we expand our scope, including middle school and high school participants, we see very interesting trends. So this was conducted in 2012, and more than 2,000 grade 3 to 12 students in Seoul and its vicinity. And we can identify that in motivation factors, we see very interesting curvilinear trend were identified. That means there we can identify consistent decrease from grades 3 to 6 and 7 and 8. But interestingly, when they were attending high school, somehow their motivation level a little bit increased. For example here, in factor 1, ideal L2 self case, as I said before, in grade 3 to grade 8, we see constant decrease. However, from grade 9 to grade 12, we see a little bit increase. But the point, interesting point is factor 7, demotivation. In this case, demotivation, the level of demotivation is, in general, they were increasing. So when we compare motivational components and demotivation, we see the relationship is not just opposite. So what I'm talking about opposite is that motivation and demotivation, the relationship is not just straightforward. And also, in qualitative research, we can see very interesting overlap between motivation and demotivation. So in this case, I collected qualitative data from 75 university students, and they were required to write essays about their previous English learning experiences for the past 10 years from K to 12. And the participants' motivation and demotivation, as you can see, were not just opposite, if not similar. So in this case, in the upper graph, that is describing motivational changing aspect. And in the lower level graph, this is describing the demotivation nature. So if there is an opposite direction can be identified between motivation and demotivation, the graph of increase or decrease should be exactly opposite. But as you can see in this frequency graph, the relationship is not that straightforward. So another line of research in demotivation is not just decrease of motivation. This is just a novel or distinctive construct which is different from motivation. In this line of research, they were mostly cross-sectional, quantitative methods, and sometimes interview method was used. And L2 motivation is conceptualized as a novel, distinctive construct that differentiates itself from L2 learning motivation. Actually, they used many quantitative research methods, including structural equational modeling. For example, one classic study was conducted by Zoltán Donay himself, and it was Hungarian secondary school study. And in this study, he used factor analysis, and he identified 9 demotivating factors, such as teacher personalities, commitment, competence, teaching methods, and number 2, inadequate school facilities. Number 3, reduced self-confidence due to their experience of failure or lack of success. 4, negative attitudes toward the foreign language. 5, compulsory nature of the foreign language study. 6, interference of another foreign language. 7, negative attitude toward the community of the foreign language spoken. 8, attitude of group members. And finally, course books used in class. So in this line of research, as you can see, they collected data and they used many quantitative methods and they extracted unique factors for demotivation. So let's briefly summarize motivation study. We can identify general findings. Number one, not only demotivated students, but also highly motivated ones show varying degrees of demotivation. That means even though we can identify highly motivated students, the same student may also show high level of demotivation because the relationship between motivation and demotivation, those relationship is not just mirror negative image. And one interesting contrast was identified between Korean study and Japanese study regarding teacher factor. In many Korean studies, teacher was identified as one of the major demotivating factors. But in Japanese study, most of those studies did not identify teacher as demotivating factor. So this is the field that we need some kind of collaborative, comparative study for international level. And number 3, social environment exerts significant influence on demotivation. And 4, demotivation and motivation have different trajectories, and they are not just a mirror image to each other. So at this point, it seems useful to distinguish demotivator and demotivation. According to Kikuchi, demotivator is a specific internal and external forces that reduce or diminish the motivational basis of behavior, intention, or an ongoing action. And demotivation is the end result. So like this is some kind of contrast between demotivation and motivation. Here, in the middle, learner's state of motivation is placed, and on the left side, there exist demotivators, and on the right side, there are motivators. So depending on demotivators or motivators, the learner's motivation level may fluctuate. And according to Kikuchi's conceptualization, demotivation is the whole picture. So like in this example, it was demotivating for Mina to experience demotivators, such as receiving a low score or being in inappropriate classes. So like this, in this case, demotivator should be receiving a low score. So this kind of specific incident will function as a specific demotivator. And let me move on to the second topic for today's talk, EFL teacher, demotivation, and motivation. I think this is quite academically quite intriguing and very interesting research field, because as ESL, EFL practitioner, we always see this kind of very close relationship between teacher motivation and student motivation. The relationship will be very co-constructive and interdependent. In other words, if you are highly motivated ESL, EFL teacher, and then your students will tend to become much more motivated, or vice versa. If you are not so much motivated, and then such low level of motivation will be contagious to your students. That means your students will be demotivated. So when we are investigating teacher motivation and demotivation, the first task is to distinguish pre-service teacher and in-service teacher. So for today's talk, what I mean by pre-service teacher is usually they are college of education students because they want to become English teacher after graduation. So when you talk about pre-service teachers' initial career motives, the main question is what motivates language teacher or teacher candidates to enter this profession. So remember that this is the result collected from pre-service teacher or College of Education students. The first intrinsic factor was love of the language and teaching, because basically they liked English language. That was the first factor. And the second one was the chance or potentials for growth. Realizing the potentials for personal, professional growth can provide chances for ESL learners and teachers to be motivated. And the third factor was previous L2 learning experience. Because when they were attending high school, for example, they had very good English teacher, so they want to become like him or her. That's one example of positive previous L2 learning experience. So because of such kind of positive experiences, they want to become English teacher. And the last factor was altruism. Consider teaching important to positively influence the next generation. In other words, this is philanthropic causes, or the teacherly way, 사도. So this kind of intrinsic factors were their pre-service teachers' initial career motives. However, at the same time, we can also think about external factors. So why do they want to become English teachers? The first factor is female friendliness. And particularly for EFL field, we can identify many female teachers. And when they were deciding on university major, in many cases, their parents strongly persuaded them to become English teacher because it was regarded as a very stable profession and it is very female friendly. So that was the prime factor, particularly for female students. And second one is material reward. And material rewards such as guaranteed pay and pension plan for educators in many disadvantaged local settings. This one is the second factor for pre-service teachers. And the third one is social ladder. In districts or nation where education opportunities are restricted, teaching is considered to continue toward tertiary education. So because of that, in many parts of the world, we still see the tuition fee for College of Education is relatively inexpensive compared to different academic disciplines. And the fourth factor is globalization. And particularly for English language, in the era of globalization, EFL proficiency can be perceived as a measure of affluence and social savviness. So they are extrinsic factors for pre-service teachers. However, we are also quite interested in-service teachers' motivation and demotivation. So what makes them to be motivated or demotivated? So I asked the many in-service teachers. So number one, the motivating factors. Number one, teaching autonomy. This autonomy serves as motivating factors, and they have considerable freedom to choose teaching methods based on their learners' L2 proficiency. And number two, learners' communicative involvement. When they are actually having lively conversation between them and their students, they are motivated. And number three, L2 teachers as role models for L2 learners. This stimulates L2 learners' interactions, which as a result positively triggers L2 teachers' motivation. So whenever they hear from their students that they want to become English teacher like him or her, when English teacher is hearing such kind of comments from their students, and then it will function as a very strong motivator. However, in many parts of the world, we see some kind of discrepancy between pre-service teacher and in-service teachers' motivation level. Because novice L2 teachers can discover the actual teaching site is very different from what they initially envisioned. For instance, novice L2 teachers in Japan, according to Kumazawa, reported their primary source of difficulties as being the gap between what they had expected and what they actually experienced in the classroom. So because such kind of difference can be identified quite a lot, this will become initially function as the a very strong demotivator. And when you talk about initial in-service teachers' demotivation, we can think about individual level as well as contextual level. In terms of individual level, the first factor will be colleague factor. Very disappointingly, some colleagues who are unsupportive toward their innovative teaching methods will lead to a sense of isolation to many EFL teachers. So, because of this, the existence of unsupportive teachers, they are demotivated. And also, the second factor is school culture. Particularly for novice in-service teachers, teachers are often expected to deal with an excessive amount of paperwork and prepare extracurricular activities. So this kind of administrative jobs are making them demotivated. However, we can also think about contextual factor. So regarding individual factor, that is kind of micro factors, but this contextual level, this is macro factor. The first one is parental factor. Specifically, excessive parental involvement are making a teacher demotivated. Parental doubts on teacher's ability and excessive interest in teaching will function as a detrimental factor for teacher autonomy. And community, teaching methods and changing social status. There are discrepancy between socially preferred teaching methods and teachers' ones serves as a detrimental variable. That means every teacher has his or her own way of teaching, but in some case, for example, from school principal or head teacher or from their parents, they are required to teach in another way. So such kind of gap between their own teaching belief and teaching practices are making them demotivated. And also, the traditionally prestigious position of EFL teacher is rapidly changing because nowadays the educational level in the society in general, we are highly educated in general. So everyone wants to say something about English. So regarding traditional status of EFL or ESL teacher, the status is not that high compared to previous generations. So far, I explained demotivation and also teachers' motivation and demotivation. And the third component for today's talk is how we are going to remotivate our students' low level of motivation. So for this, I'm going to introduce motivational languaging activities, or MLAs. The concept of languaging was originally stated by Vygotsky. And the idea may seem a little bit difficult to understand, but in reality, this is quite simple. If we look at the last line, the coming to know while speaking phenomenon, in our daily lives, we frequently experience this kind of things. Before we actually start to explain some concept to our friends, we just, in our head, we just imagine that, oh, we completely understood that concept. However, after we actually started to explain that concept to other people, we suddenly realized that, oh, we did not completely understand that concept. So the activity of saying something, the activity of explaining something to others is giving the food for thought. So regarding this, Vygotsky has mentioned that thought is not merely expressed in words. It comes into existence through them. Thought undergoes many changes as it turns into speech. It finds its reality and form. So focusing on this aspect of language, according to Mary Swain, she coined this term, languaging. This is a form of verbalization used to mediate the solutions to complex problems and tasks. So this original concept of languaging is usually cognitive concept. So by being engaged in cognitively complex tasks, we can develop our second language proficiency. That is the original concept of languaging. However, for today's talk, I'm going to extend this original concept into motivational languaging. So it has been extended to the purpose of bringing out the effective and motivational changes among L2 learners. So in this case, motivational languaging can be broadly defined as coming to be motivated while speaking or writing something phenomenon. So for example, if a student is bragging about his or her future aspiration, like I'm going to become a K-pop star in the future, and then I'm going to visit United States or Hollywood, and then I'm going to be on Billboard chart. So this kind of aspiration is spoken to other friends. So my point is that if they are actually saying like that, such kind of activity of saying something is positively affecting their motivational level. In mainstream psychology, this aspect has been already highlighted, like mere measurement effect. The mere act of responding to surveys, for example, this act changes subsequent opinions and behavior. So we can identify major differences between the original concept of languaging and motivational languaging. In the case of motivational languaging, we are actively encouraging the use of first language in this motivational languaging activities. But in the original concept, the use of L2 has been always emphasized. So, why I am focusing on this kind of motivational languaging for remotivating strategies? Because in many parts of the world, including Korea and many Asian contexts, students are not much encouraged to think about their future in English classes. So even though they are engaged in learning activity, they do not think about how they are going to use such English language in the future. So the idea is that if we have the chance, if we are giving them the chance to think about their own future by using English, their motivation will be increased. And thinking about and talking about or writing on L2 speaking competent future through motivational languaging will enhance students' level of L2 learning motivation. So languaging will lead to not only cognitive but also affective motivational changes. So today's talk, I have two research questions. First, to what extent is motivational languaging effective in enhancing elementary, middle, and high school students' level of L2 learning motivation in Korea, as well as in many Asian contexts? And which types of motivational languaging activities are useful for the EFL learners? Because of time constraint, I'm just focusing on study one. It was conducted in spring semester. It was conducted in regular classroom English class, and more than 800 elementary and junior high school students participated in this research. Because it was conducted in regular English classroom, it was not that easy to implement motivational languaging activities because basically EFL teachers are too busy and they have lots of things to teach. So for 14 weeks, 8 times every other week, this MLA, motivational languaging activities, were implemented, either before or after the class for 10 to 15 minutes. And because I was actually interested in how much, to what degree their motivation level has been increased. So because I had such kind of purpose, pre and post survey were conducted on L2 learning motivation. Statistically, it was repeated measure t-test. So you may be wondering, what is motivational languaging? So as you can see in this case, First, in many cases, in usual case, they were required to watch a very short YouTube clip. And in that YouTube clip, those clips included Korean celebrities, such as famous sports star, such as Son Heung-min, or K-pop star like BTS, or famous diplomat, like as you can see, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, former UN Secretary General, who spoke excellent English as an L2. After they were watching very short YouTube clip of speaking English from those celebrities, and then they were reading how those celebrities learned English. So, as you can see, this is very short reading passage. And then they were placed in 3 different experimental groups. First case, English learning diary group. Second, opinion writing group. Third, group discussion case. In English learning diary group, they did those English learning diary while they were reflecting on what they did last week on their English classes. And reading those writing prompts, they were completing English learning diary. And in the second case, that was opinion writing group. After watching those short video clips and reading on exemplary cases that you have seen before, and the students wrote what they felt. And again, they had many writing prompts, such as, in 20 years, where, how, and for what will you be using English? So by looking at those writing prompts, they were thinking first, and then they wrote about their own opinion. And the third case, that was group discussion. So mainly, the format was exactly the same, but in the end, they were required not writing, but have a group discussion with their classmates. So in terms of types of languaging, in the first 2 groups, in English learning diary and opinion writing condition, they were written languaging. In the third one, group discussions case, they were spoken languaging context. So students were engaged in those MLAs. So as you can see, English learning diary group and opinion writing group. So remember that for those opinion writing group as well as group discussions case, first they watched YouTube and then they read exemplary reading materials, and then they were engaged in writing or group discussion. And this is the result of using motivational languaging. And after we conducted those activities for almost a semester, we could see that for elementary school's case, in opinion writing group, we see at least in 3 motivational subcomponents in ideal L2 self, attitude toward English learning, and intuitiveness, we can identify statistically significant increase. In the case of middle school or junior high school's case, for English learning diary case and opinion writing's case, we see statistically significant increase in their motivational level. So if we summarize the effectiveness of using motivational languaging activities for remotivating our students, in opinion writing activities case, for elementary school students, statistically significant increase in ideal L2 self, attitude toward English learning, and intuitiveness. For middle school students' case, cultural interest was statistically significantly increased. And for English learning diary activity, for junior high school students, statistically significant increase in their O2 L2 self, but statistically significant decrease in the attitude toward English learning. So overall, it was very effective for our elementary and junior high school students' case. So appropriate languaging can function as a useful mediational tool or educational springboard for creating the ideal L2 self. Or if we conduct this kind of motivational languaging activities, we can actually increase students' level of motivation. And compared to oral languaging, written MLAs, such as opinion writing and English learning diary, were found to be much more effective. So let's recap my talk. For practical implications for future motivation research, much more data need to be collected to address the students' and teachers' real voice on their motivation and demotivation, because most of the research used quantitative measure. So that means real voice from our students and also in-service and pre-service teachers did not actually appear. So we need diverse sets of motivational data. Pre- and in-service teachers need to know different levels of educational settings to prevent from their initial demotivation as well as emotional labor. And different sets of MLAs need to be introduced to elementary, middle, high school, and university students by using action research designs. And for future research design, more systematic research will be required to define the exact nature of demotivation, teacher motivation, and demotivation. Because compared to motivational construct, demotivation and teacher motivation, demotivation, those constructs are still quite new concept in our field. And motivation and its related psychological factors, such as vision enhancement, learner resilience, grit, buoyancy, those ideas should be investigated in the future, because we see remotivation is clearly related to how we are going to increase students' vision, future dream. So those academic fields will be our next direction. And also, academically, we are now emphasizing on learner diversity. And again, this is quite different ideas, because in previous generation, we have focused on the generalization. So how we can identify learners' motivation. So by using many quantitative measures, we extracted many generalized factors. However, nowadays, at the turn of the century, we are also emphasizing how different our learners are. So by using complex dynamic systems theory or directed motivational currents, which is actively engaged by Zoltan Donay and his colleagues, and also by using qualitative research methods as well as mixed methods, we can expand the scope of motivation and demotivation research. That's all for today's talk. So thank you very much for your attentive listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your informative and insightful presentation, Dr. Kim. And thank you everyone for your comments and questions for the presentation. And we have a few questions, and we have only 7 minutes. And I picked up 2 questions for you. And the first question is from Maiko Berger, and saying, thank you very much for sharing the state of the art in Korea. In Japanese public schools, I think teachers are too busy for professional development. What methods or programs are provided in Korea to sustain and remotivate English teachers?
That's quite a good question, I think. And this, the first thing is that we need to have a very close collaboration between Ministry of Education and actual teachers. So, and also in academic field, we also need to have collaboration between teachers and professors. But unfortunately, I think such kind of seamless collaboration between those important figures are not so active these days. But I think in terms of educational level, because in the Bureau of Educational Settings, they have lots of programs for in-service teacher retraining. So I think by participating in those kind of in-service teacher retraining program they can incorporate such kind of remotivation program for demotivated ESL, EFL teachers. So this can be one of the methods to actually increase students' motivation level.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Kim. And here's the second question. Saying, thank you so much for the informative sharing, Professor Kim. I'm doing my PhD study on this topic, demotivation among university students in Malaysia ESL context. Do you think there is a significant differences in demotivation between EFL and ESL contexts?
When you compare demotivation issue in ESL and EFL context, I think it will be very broad, huge differentiation between ESL and EFL, because even in the same ESL context, depending on the national setting or regional setting, the situation will be very different. And also quite equally in EFL setting as well, depending on its region or nation, the situation is also quite different. So it may be very overstatement to say ESL demotivation and EFL demotivation are similar or different. We have to be microscopic, and then we have to actually look at each actual context. So after we look at those specific contexts, and then we can diagnose what is really happening in those specific populations. So I'm not so sure about the distinction between ESL and EFL demotivation.
Okay, thank you for your answer, Dr. Kim. We are running out of time. So we have 3 minutes left. But I think if you have more questions, please email him about your question. And then I think this presentation was really helpful because it not only covers the learning motivation, but also covers teaching motivation. So thank you very much about this presentation, Professor Kim. And thank you everyone for your participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is the end of a plenary speech. Now the closing ceremony will begin shortly at 4:50. Korea Standard Time. So please don't go away, and we'll see you at the closing ceremony. Thank you very much.